11 days. That's exactly how long after Kindred Devices shipped their new hardware before the first unit started overheating under heavy load. The project team had been staring down a strict trade show deadline. According to their original timeline, they were going to miss that launch window by 3 full weeks. To hit the date, leadership demanded they accelerate the schedule. This chart breaks down the fallout. They compressed the timeline to save 3 weeks on paper, but then recall started. The middle figure shows reverse logistics cost 5 times what those weeks saved. All damage tracks back to one single quality gate treated as negotiable. The project didn't fail because the team worked too quickly. It failed because they executed an acceleration without a structural plan for what they were actually compressing. When leadership demands a fixed date, the standard instinct for a project manager is to open the schedule and start squeezing phases together until the math works out. We can see exactly how that played out in this diagram, comparing the original plan to the fast-tracked version. The exact point of failure is located right here at the QA gate. It was completely stripped of its sequential authority. To make up the missing time, the project manager decided to run the battery management firmware validation in parallel with final assembly, rather than waiting for the units to be fully built before testing them. In the short term, this looked like a brilliant tactical maneuver. Overlapping those two phases fully absorbed the 3-week deficit, leaving them with 2 days to spare on the Gantt chart before the trade show. But schedule compression that simply overlaps dependent tasks is an illusion of efficiency. It masks a deferred failure by passing the technical risk directly down to the customer. Most teams fall into what we can call the single lever fallacy. They assume that accelerating a project simply means adding headcount, cutting buffer margins, and pushing the team harder across the board. This mindset dangerously treats every task on the timeline as if it carries the exact same amount of technical risk. That's why Kindred's manager treated firmware validation and final assembly as interchangeable blocks, just sliding them together to run simultaneously. But that specific overlap is technically invalid. You cannot test thermal management firmware in a vacuum. Validating how a battery dissipates heat strictly requires the final assembled casing to test the real-world physics of the device. When you run a verification checkpoint in parallel with the build phase, it stops being a gate. It loses the physical ability to prevent bad units from shipping. This brings us to the first discipline of a system called the surge framework, designed to accelerate schedules safely. Sequence the critical chain. Treating a critical end-of-line verification step as an adjustable scheduling element inherently invalidates the entire project timeline. To achieve true acceleration, you have to apply strict structural rules. This is the surge framework. The first step is distinguishing between tasks running in sequence out of pure habit versus tasks running in sequence out of strict necessity. The operational rule is rigid. You only fast-track and parallelize workstreams that have zero actual technical dependency on one another, which leads us to the U in surge: unbundle before you compress. This directly addresses the problem of massive, unbroken task blocks on a schedule. Instead of trying to squeeze a large task all at once, you break it down. This isolates the smaller subcomponents that can actually be run simultaneously without breaking dependencies. Kindred's validation phase was scheduled as one monolithic block. Because they never broke it down, they rushed the entire testing process instead of structurally isolating what could be safely parallelized. Real schedule compression is achieved through careful redesign and unbundling. Applying raw time pressure to a monolithic block will always result in a breakdown. The second major error Kindred made during their acceleration was how they deployed their engineering headcount. It's incredibly common for project managers to rely on blanket overtime, spreading additional resources evenly across the entire project pipeline. But that approach ignores the G in our framework: give the constraint the resources. This is known as crashing the constraint. You have to identify the singular bottleneck task in your workflow and direct all those added resources specifically to that node. In Kindred's case, the project manager added engineers everywhere, especially to the firmware track, except to the specific thermal QA team. That team was the actual constraint dictating the timeline, and they were left alone. Adding headcount to non-critical path items creates a flurry of activity, but it does absolutely nothing to advance the final delivery date. Throwing resources anywhere other than the strict bottleneck is just theatrical efficiency. It spends the budget, but buys zero real time. There is an unspoken casualty that happens whenever schedule pressure increases: the quiet, undocumented reduction of project scope. To prevent this, a team must practice strict scope integrity. You can compress the sequence of how work flows, but you must never shrink the verification work itself. That is the R in Surge. Reinforce, don't remove, quality gates. Counterintuitively, checkpoints require more scrutiny and time under intense schedule pressure, not a faster rubber stamp. Which brings us to the final safeguard. Evaluate the trade-off first. You have to price out the true cost of the acceleration itself before you execute it. This requires a mandatory financial calculation. You must explicitly weigh the cost of crashing the schedule directly against the potential cost of a catastrophic delay. Kindred leadership completely failed to do this. They priced the cost of missing the trade show based purely on optimism. Executing speed without a hard, quantified trade-off analysis is gambling disguised as engineering. Following the recall, Kindred Devices was forced to adopt permanent institutional changes to how they manage product launches. This table outlines Kindred's transition and operational standards. They replaced deadline improvisation with a structured execution approach. The ultimate metric for this system is located right here. Maintaining a 100% quality gate pass rate, entirely unaffected by schedule pressure. Professional project management offices do not improvise compression. They build a defined, pre-approved fast lane process with its own rigid set of checks and balances, because professional project execution requires standardizing your acceleration framework well before an organizational crisis actually hits. The financial cost of a recall is devastating, but the lingering consequence for Kindred was the loss of customer trust, and trust is infinitely harder to rebuild than a Gantt chart. To ensure the organization retains that lesson, there is one final rule. Every single acceleration decision must be formally debriefed and locked, regardless of whether the project succeeds or fails. Speed that you didn't carefully plan for is simply borrowed time, and you almost always end up repaying it by sacrificing quality. For an engineering leader, every schedule acceleration is a decision about what to protect. True execution edge doesn't come from pushing a team harder. It comes from rigorously engineering the path they run on.